Do you do any poem from Keats? Okay. So this is actually Keats's ode to autumn. And Jonathan Bate has given us a reading, how we could do an eco-critical reading of a poem like, or the ode to autumn. So, and I'm quoting Bate, one effect of global warming will be, or is already, a powerful increase in the severity of winds in Northern Europe. The swallow has great difficulty in coping with wind. So there's a genuine possibility that within the lifetime of today's students in Britain will cease to be a country to which this bird migrates. Keats' ode to autumn is predicted upon the certainty of the following spring's return. The poem will look very different if there is soon an autumn when gathering swallows twitter in the skies for the last time. So what is it that Bate is saying? That this poem would make sense only as long we have, for literary students of English in Britain, still have swallows coming to Britain and singing the spring, right? As they stop singing those spring songs, the whole idea of celebrating spring with the swallows coming home will become null and void. So do you understand how eco-critical reading can throw a completely different light on our understanding of a literary text? And the text is still the same. It's still 200 years old or more than 200 years old. But it can completely renew our emphasis on a text which otherwise would have nothing else to say. So this is just a small example of how you can do an eco-critical reading of a conventional poem. Now, I want to come to something that is closer home. And I'll be dealing with, this is the last part of the talk, Anthropocene, Petrofiction, and Cli-Fi. And I'll be mostly talking about the two writers, and which is why I call it environmental humanities in the global turn is because so far we have all been talking about, or I have been talking about critics who are basically from the global north or from the west. Dipesh Chakraborty and Amitabh Ghosh are two critics who have contributed majorly to the decolonization of theory regarding and related to environmental humanities and eco-criticism. So first, let's look at Dipesh Chakraborty, who has this very famous essay by now, The Climate of History 4 thesis, which was published in Critical Inquiry in 2009. So he proposes four theses here, four ideas basically. The first one is that anthropogenic explanations of climate change collapse the categories of human history and natural history. So what he's basically trying to say that when we think of human history, we think of usually the last either 400 years of the so-called quote-unquote modernity, or the last 10,000 years of agriculture, civilization, and so on and so forth. Now, because of climate change, and because climate change has increasingly being viewed as anthropogenic, meaning man being responsible or humans being responsible for climate change, we can no longer separate human history from natural history. The two are now collapsed, okay? And how have the two become collapsed is explained in the second thesis that he proposes. And this is where he says that the idea of the Anthropocene plays a crucial role. Now, what is the idea of the Anthropocene? Now, we all know that the Pleistocene era, which is the end of the Ice Age, led to the Holocene. So around 10,000 years back, humans started agriculture, that led to settled civilization, and that led to the rise of writing, and so on and so forth. And from the Ice Age to more warmer age also facilitated the kind of growth of agriculture and animal husbandry that led to a change in our geological age, so to say, of the earth. And we still think of living in the Holocene, except that in the year 2000, a Nobel Prize winning chemist called Paul Crutzen and his collaborator, who is a marine scientist, Eugene Stormer, wrote in the year 2000, and I quote, and the idea of the Anthropocene would become clear. They say, considering major and still growing impacts of human activities on Earth and atmosphere, including global scales, it seems more than appropriate to emphasize the central role of mankind in geology and ecology by proposing to use the term Anthropocene for the current geological epoch. So what we have been thinking of as the Holocene, the warm welcome, as you all know, some of you already know, the Holocene itself, the term was coined only in the 19th century. And between the coinage of the term and its acceptance was another 50 years or so. So, Crutzen and Stormer feels that it's now time for us to think of the Anthropocene. So the Anthropocene is basically nothing but a geological epoch where the impact of man or impact of human activities on the atmosphere and the environment has led to an impact on nature. So man-driven, human-driven change has led to change in our geological presence, leading to coinage of the term of the Anthropocene, that man has driven change in such a way that the Earth's atmosphere has changed. And Dipesh Chakraborty is saying that when we think of the Anthropocene, we have to think of humans no longer as a biological force, but as a geological force. So all humans are biological forces, right? In fact, medicine and health basically look at humans as a biological entity. We all are that. There's no denying that. But when we say geological, it's a far more powerful force. So when we think of the term Anthropocene, we're thinking of human beings, collective, impact as a species. We're no longer thinking of individual human or individual nature or caste or religion. We're thinking of the species human and their impact on the environment, on the world, on the planet, and calling that an Anthropocene. So that our impact has been so severe that now it's time to call for a new geological epoch, and that is that of the Anthropocene. So the Anthropocene could be simply defined as the current geological age where human has been the dominant influence on the environment and has made lasting changes or irreparable changes that we cannot revert back or change back. The third thesis that he proposes is that of the entanglement of global histories of capital with species histories of human. Now, this is a little complicated because, after all, Dipesh Chakraborty, as you all know, is a historian who has dealt on histories of peasant uprising, subaltern history, post-colonial history. And he's suggesting that historians have largely either concentrated on the last 10,000 years or have concentrated on the last 400 years. If you are a historian of the modern period, you have mostly concentrated on the 400 years. But now there is a call to, and Edward Wilson has this book called In Search of Nature in 1996, where he calls an engagement with deep history. So what does Wilson say? He says that human behavior is seen as a product of not just recent history of 10,000 years, but of deep history, a combined genetic and cultural traits that created humanity. Now, the moment you say that we have to engage with deep history, not the 400 years history or 10,000 years history, but the entire history that has created us, it leads to many questions. And as a writer coming from the developing nation, Dipesh Chakraborty would ask this question, that this emphasis on species history, on man as a species, might marginalize the questions of inequality, between the West and the East, because the environmental degradation that we're talking about is mostly degradation leading from fossil fuel. How are the last 400 years different? 1750 onwards is because we are increasingly dependent on fossil fuel. So this is the era where fossil fuel has driven, quote unquote, growth or civilization. And where have all these fossil fuels been burned or utilized? It's mostly in the quote unquote developed first world nations, the rich nations. And the poor nations are still trying to emulate that history, right? The India, China, Brazil are still trying to emulate and reach to that. But where are the highest numbers of carbon emission? It's in the West. Where is the highest amount of burning of fossil fuel? Who have benefited from the so quote unquote that development that is gearing on fossil fuel and coal and oil and all of that is the West. So this division of the rich and the poor and the whole history of civilization that have kind of led to the growth of capitalist industrial nation, if we suddenly start talking about species history and all humans as equally responsible for climate change and environmental degradation, it is a lopsided view. So Dipesh Chakraborty brings in a very, very important understanding, suggesting that to put all the nations together, it's very welcome. We are thinking of a universal history for the first time maybe, but at the same time it may be dangerous because we are putting the onus on people who had nothing to do with, say, the car or the aeroplane till the beginning of the 20th century or the middle of the 20th century. How are those people equally responsible for the environmental degradation and burning of fossil fuel that the world has now come to Anthropocene, the same way as somebody who had access to the car right from the beginning of the 20th century? So the fourth thesis that Chakraborty proposes, that the experience of climate change as unifying a sense of species identity, a universal us, is predicated on a catastrophe, that it's only a catastrophe like the Anthropocene that people can think of an universal us. Otherwise, we all have to recognize that we come from completely different levels of realities. A tribe who still live in the Andamans without any access to, say, motorcycle or car or bike has a very, very different impact on climate change than you and I who have access to motor cars and so on and so forth. So what Dipesh Chakraborty is trying to say that it is futile to think of a universal us, while it is very welcome to think of climate change, but to club all humanity as a species, we might actually negate the differences once again, and it might be dangerous. Okay. As students of literature, we come back to what we got to do with it, right? Okay, climate change is fine, environmental degradation is fine. So how has literature dealt with it? So Amitav Ghosh wrote this, or used this term petrofiction in his review of Abdul Rahman Munif's set of novels, Cities of Salt, in 1992. And he calls that petrofiction is the oil encounter, between the US and the Middle East that is directly connected to the oil industry. And much later, Imre Zimen argues that petrofiction is not necessarily only limited to Middle East and US, it can be used extensively, and it can be a new periodizing method for the modern world, which is predicated on petro-enabled services. So, Zimen suggests that any literature that has dealt with the development of, human life or civilization, which is predicated on petro-enabled services, could be periodized as petrofiction. So that would kind of define all literature post, the discovery and use of petrol or oil, meaning basically end of the 19th or beginning of the 20th century. So as students of literature, it is important for us to be aware of the changing periodization that are being proposed in the way we understand literature or literary periods. Amitav Ghosh also has this very interesting book called The Great Derangement, Climate Change and the Unthinkable, where he talks about the major challenges for poor nations, for poor people, like people living on Sundarbans and so on and so forth, who would have, to kind of, who would have to bear the impact of climate change firsthand. No, so very often it is often said that climate change does not impact the rich and the poor differently. You can have a forest fire in California, the most richest part of the world in California, equally as you can have a forest fire or a tsunami or a flood in Africa or Bangladesh. But what Amitabh Ghosh is also suggesting is that sometimes that impact is felt more by the poor people than by the rich. And this leads us to the final point that I want to, and I'll conclude in the next 5 minutes, is of CLI-FI. So to come back to the students, what do you understand by CLI-FI? It's nothing but climate fiction. Like you have science fiction, you have detective fiction. So climate fiction, fiction that deals with the impact of climate change, the impact of the environment on human. And this is a genre that's becoming very, very popular increasingly because it talks about something fundamental to the human, and it appeals to us as a species, because there's nobody who can escape the wrath of climate change. So if you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please share them. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for the very lucid and very well-structured presentation. And it especially reminded me and Pranami Bunia, ma'am, of a classroom in TU. So, and I'm sure all the participants, especially the students, they were immensely benefited by this talk. Now, we have a short interactive session where the participants can post their queries in the chat box. And I now request Dr. Saba Anish to kindly conduct the interactive session. Thank you, ma'am, so much for your talk.
Thank you, Dr. Hemjyoti, ma'am. That was a very, very lucid and informative presentation, starting with not only the history of all these branches, but going into, literary reading, and then making us all realize that environment is something that cuts across all branches and discipline. Right from literature to geology, how we need to be accountable to environment. And then moving into concluding your lecture with a political reading of environment and new categorization of periods and all that. So the platform is now, I hope it has been very, very useful to all the participants who have been listening. The platform is now open for discussion. If you have any queries, doubts, or even feedback, I think I'll check out in the chat box and we have something probably. Let me check out. Ma'am, I'll reach back to you. Okay. Elizabeth Buragohai, who has a question. A very good afternoon, ma'am. Could you please explain how the text is oriented to ensure human accountability to environment?
Yes. Thank you, Elizabeth. I mean, that question is coming from that pointers that, see, one of the ways is that if you look at, going back to the poem that we read, the part of the poem Keats is, that it is important for us to, because some texts are written in their times, right? Texts are universal, but they are also specific to the history that create them. So in that way, we can no longer hold accountable, say, Keats to the kind of standards that we expect. But we can definitely hold accountable the text in our reading. So what he meant is that how we read the text and do not shy away from entering with these questions, engaging with these questions, and not shy away from simply because a great poet wrote it, and so we are just going to accept it. Like many post-colonial writers pointed out that the Indian students read Daffodils by Wordsworth, and we were expected to participate in his glee without ever seeing the daffodils, right? I mean, your generation is a little different because you can Google and see pictures of daffodils. But when we were students, we read daffodils. We had no idea how the daffodil looked. So it doesn't therefore mean an invalid reading of daffodils. So by human accountability to environment, what he meant was that we must open up the text to be able to, derive it or direct it towards an eco-critical reading. That is what he meant. That I hope that answers your questions, Elizabeth. There is Priyanka Bora who has raised her hand. Sabha, should we take her?
Yeah, Priyanka Bora, you raised your hand. If you're there, you can unmute yourself and put over your question directly to ma'am. Priyanka Bora, are you there? Just need to unmute yourself and put across your question. By the time she comes back or ready with her question, we can move on to the next question. It's by Ashwini B. What role the ecofeminists play in this pandemic? A very relevant question, I suppose.
Yes, Ashwini, thank you for that, because I wanted to spend a little more time on Vandana Shiva, but because I had to move to, what they have been arguing in a way has been found true. That if we tamper with nature, then nature is going to get back at us. And in some way, you see that playing out right in front of us, right? We still do not know whether it's a man-made virus or human lab-created virus. But what the eco-feminists or the eco-critics have always been identifying as troublesome: genetic engineering, genetic modification, and so forth. So there's a very thin line, right? I mean, we need vaccines for viruses, but at the same time, so how the pandemic has played out has kind of made the resolves of some of the ecofeminists even more stronger. And in a way, it has played out in front of us. I mean, all of us have been, it's something that we cannot even see. And you imagine the havoc that it has played in our life. So it is a testimony to the changing climates in a way. So it's a globalized world. I mean, we all know about the Spanish flu, which was contained within the next 2-3 years, and countries like India were not even highly impacted, right? But with this global, and which is why Dipesh Chakraborty is important, the political reading of climate change is equally important, because when you talk about a global connectivity, global trade, globalization of capital, viruses also go global, right? So ecofeminists have kind of renewed their emphasis on or against bioengineering and, so through the pandemic. Elizabeth has another question. Eco cinema, well, I mean, that's so relevant. Bhaiseng Dohatia's Baghjan has just been nominated to go to Cannes. I read that. Many of you know his film Jol Sobi and Handuk. So this film on the Baghjan oil spillage has been nominated for the Cannes Film Festival, and so that's a major area that our part of the world is doing great. Then, yes, Sabha,
Anisha, she's our student. She has a question for you. Good afternoon, ma'am. My question to you is, in what ways might we destigmatize ecological views in order to promote ecofeminism?
Yeah, it is very important, Anisha, to destigmatize. I mean, see, one way of doing it is, of course, in our everyday life. We all have seen impacts of the say, to give a very simple example, the vegetables and fruits that we eat. They're all urea fed, insecticide, pesticide laden, and so on and so forth. And any doctor would tell you the number of gallstone operations that have risen in the past, say, 10 years or 15 years in Assam and around is mind-boggling, right? And it cannot be that suddenly everybody has become ill. It has to be connected to, in fact, Vandana Shiva has this very important thing that you are what you eat. We are what we eat. And one of the ways of driving the ecological or eco-critical, eco-feminist perspective to the common people, to the general people who did not understand Dipesh Chakraborty, but who understand food, because every human being understand food. And one of the campaigns that, and it ties back to what Ashwini B asked regarding the pandemic, and what it taught us, that at some level we have to be self-sufficient, and it cannot go on the way it's gone on for so long. I mean, the obsession with bioengineering has become so huge that people were developing square watermelons because it was easier to transport them, right? Because it will stop degradation while being transported. So people were developing square tomatoes and square watermelons because they'll fit in boxes very neatly without wasting any space. So, I mean, you can see the obsession. There is no end to that kind of, desire to bioengineer, and there is a limit to it. That's what the ecofeminists and the eco-critics are saying.
Okay. Ma'am, Pragya Hazarika has more or less the same question like Anisha.
Pragya, today, because Joycing Dahotia's film is, I just read the news in the morning, so it came immediately. But I am not really prepared to talk about eco-cinema, maybe in another panel, because I'll need some time to, I have watched a few, but it's not enough to kind of talk about them, And the other thing is also that we always must respect that as a student of literature, I understand that my training is in doing literary texts. If I want to do cinema or review cinema, then I have to read up or train myself in visual culture. It's not enough. I mean, we do that. Many of us read as kind of a film as if it's a literary text. It's not. I have no idea of how camera works. It's not enough to read a cinema like a screenplay. It's not. Right. So for that, I'll take time for that. I'm not yet equipped or trained to do that.
Yeah, exactly. In cinematic, language demands a totally different kind of interpretation, which is different from literary text. But then, ma'am, you mentioned about this is, of course, I think will help our students. If you can tell a little bit more about the writers and the cli-fi that you mentioned, climatic fiction, I think that will really help our students.
Yeah, I mean, there's an entire range. I mean, you Google and you'll see that, particularly, and the interesting thing is that climate fictions are coming out not so much of, say, North America. I mean, there are texts from North America and UK, but majorly from Africa. African writers are engaging majorly. Again, the names are not coming to me immediately. I can send them to you, later on, because I stopped there. But African writers are engaging with this because, the ocean is being eaten up by plastic, right? And when you are a continent which is surrounded on three sides by the ocean, we just cannot disregard what one is doing to the ocean. And there is an entire discipline now of oceanic humanities, or blue humanities, where people are talking about how our connection to water is mediated through its own different and kind of series of histories. So, as I said, I can send you a list of texts and novels once we end, maybe by tomorrow or so, and you can all have a look at those climate fiction, so to say.
That will be very helpful, ma'am, because in the meantime, we have already made a WhatsApp group of our participants. If you can send it, we can share it in the group and participants will definitely go to it. Okay. With that, we come to a very interesting...
Priyanka Bora still has her hand raised. Do you think...
Priyanka, are you there? Your hand, it seems, is still raised. And for the participants, let me announce that the feedback form has been shared. You can fill up the forms and submit it immediately. Okay. It seems some students are seated with us in the seminar hall and they have a question, ma'am. Can I have it?
Sure.
Can I have the question? It's there in the chat box. Okay, Ananya, what can ecofeminism contribute towards multilateral global governance within the environment?
Well, in fact, if you look at, there were attempts at multilateral global governance platforms even before, let's say in the 1990s on, Our World platform, and different platforms like that. And eco-critics and eco-feminists were consulted. However, there is a wonderful critique of that platform by Shiv Vishwanathan. And he suggests that, and this is Vishwanathan's critique of such platforms, that many of these global, multilateral global platforms, what they indicate is that they appear to include voices from across the world. However, their positioning of the category human is still of a white, Western, privileged male. See, so the problem remains that we might think of a global, multilateral network or platform, but unless and until we have an internal critique of the logic through which that governance network is functioning, we are not going to necessarily arrive at a truly global understanding of what is happening to the environment. And that is what even Dipesh Chakraborty suggests, that unless and until we take into cognizance, and so both Shiv Vishwanathan and Dipesh Chakraborty, at least they are on the same platform, that unless and until we take into cognizance the different layers that cut us across the world, simply coming on a certain platform may not be enough. But one good thing is that, thanks to Greta Thunberg and thanks to in fact, because of the California fire, the place where literally the fire and the thing broke down is called Paradise, right? So Paradise in California was literally lost, and it woke up many rich people in the United States, that because so far they had, this was in 2016-17, so far they had thought that climate change, global warming, these are happening to the poor people, the poor nations, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, these are the kind of, but when it hit the very hub of the richest of the rich of the world, of course they woke up. And one of the ways in which eco-feminists or eco-critics and environmental humanists are making an impact is through the interdisciplinary, that is, they are looking at many more avenues of talking to different people's voices, when we never imagined Dipesh Chakraborty writing on climate change. So people are really enthused to talk about climate change. So I'm hopeful that itself would lead to, and the other thing is, coming back to eco-cinema, that people who are completely, outside of, say, mainstream cinema as well as mainstream academia, people like Joy Singh Lahotia, making a film like the one he does on Baghjan itself is taking this conversation onward, right? So I suppose it will happen at different levels. It will not just happen at one global platform.
Exactly, with people and talking about environment and nature in different fields, with cinema, advertisement, branches of academia. I think we are moving towards a more sustainable kind of environment, not only talks but also practices. Because very recently in UN Meet for Climate Change, we have seen a very major, right, from Indian origin, who blamed all the global leaders for not taking care of the environment and not leaving a good sustainable globe for future. I think it's all of our responsibility. And with that note, thank you so much, ma'am. But there is a small formality. We go for a vote of thanks, formal vote of thanks to be delivered by Ragini. Ragini Mohanto, the stage is.
Good afternoon to everyone. I'm sure everyone had a fulfilling time listening to Dr. Hemjyoti Medhi ma'am's enunciation of today's topic. A little announcement before I proceed with the formal vote of thanks. All the participants are requested to fill up the feedback form so that they can, receive the certificates. At the very beginning, I offer my sincere gratitude to Dr. Utpal Jyoti Mohanta sir, Principal of JP College, for giving us his valuable time and for inaugurating the event. I would like to offer my heartfelt gratitude to our esteemed resource person, Dr. Hemjyoti Medhi ma'am, for enlightening us with her insightful presentation today. Thank you so much, ma'am, for giving us your valuable time amidst your busy schedule. I would like to thank Pranami Banya ma'am, HOD of the Department of English, for being with the organizing team throughout and for sharing her positive energy and enthusiasm. I would like to thank Mushrifa Ibrahim ma'am for being a constant support and guidance in conducting this event. I would now like to thank Vishwajyoti Sharma for administering the technical aspects in conducting the event. I sincerely thank all the faculties of the Department of English for their support and guidance in every way possible. My heartfelt gratitude also extends to Ramesh Da, Rinku Da, and all the members of the canteen staff for helping us with their efforts. I offer my gratitude to all the participants for actively taking part in this event and making it a success. Last but not the least, I thank all the students of the Department of English for constantly helping us with all their efforts. With this, we come to an end of today's session. Thank you, everyone. With this, the meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.